Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We have a special guest in the building.
Yes, indeed.
AOC is what they call her.
Hello, good morning.
Welcome, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Did I say everything right?
Yep, you got it all right.
He was
welcome.
worried about it. That's why you led with
That's why I
AOC.
led with AOC. I suggested it.
But she is AOC.
It's
She
a
is.
lot of syllables.
Yes,
It's a lot
it
of
is.
syllables.
How are you this morning?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm blessed. Is it a difficult time right now?
I mean, I think it's a time everyone's a little on edge, you know, with the primary, with the election. There's a lot at stake. So I think there's always going to be high tensions. But so far, I think we're doing well. I think it's been really good. I think it's, you know, given the time and the year and everything, I think we've been holding it together pretty well.
Well, for people that don't know, tell them how you got into politics. Tell them your story. You're from the Bronx. Tell them how you got into where you're at now.
No,
The
we know
the youngest person ever in Congress, by the way, and it was amazing when you got elected.
And I always say the craziest people in America come from the Bronx and all of Florida.
That is true. That is 100% true.
So how did you get your start?
So I'm a third generation Bronxite. My dad was born in the Bronx. My grandmother moved to the Bronx from Puerto Rico. And growing up, being born in the Bronx, my parents, we felt a pressure to move out so that I could have an education. Mm-hmm. And I grew up between those two worlds, always coming, my dad had a small business in the Bronx, and always growing up with my cousins in the Bronx, with my family in the Bronx, and then the idea that our zip code determines so much of the quality of life, that the way that my parents felt like I needed a shot was to be somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And that's never been our values, and it's never been how we wanted things to be. And so after I graduated college, I moved back to the Bronx.
So where was that place? Because you said between the Bronx and where else?
So I moved to Yorktown Heights, about 40 minutes north in Westchester. And so then after I graduated college, I moved back to the Bronx and I started doing education work with young kids. And that kind of brought me into activism. And I never thought that I was going to run for political office. I didn't feel like I had the connections or the money or anything like that. But I felt like, this window really opened in 2016 where a lot of activism that was pushed to the edges is now being centered. Mm-hmm. And, I looked at my own backyard. And if we're going to really improve our country, we got to make sure that all pockets, are doing well. Okay. And I felt like our representation wasn't good enough. Mm-hmm. It's not just about Democrats versus Republicans sometimes. And sometimes we can do better as Democrats too. And so I decided to run in a primary election against a 20-year incumbent.
Took on the system.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was outspent 10-1, $3 million put in against me. But we did it the old-fashioned way, organizing, people in the community, aunts, uncles, abuelas, everybody knocking on doors. And it was probably one of the biggest upsets of 2018.
Now, for those of us who aren't Spanishly inclined, what did that mean?
Abuelas, grandmas.
Grandma, okay, got you.
Did a lot of people who traditionally weren't voting, did they come out to vote?
Yes. We expanded the electorate about 68% above the last off-year midterm primary. So we had young people voting. We had people with 2 jobs voting. We had people who had never voted before voting. People that hadn't voted since Obama in 2008 were coming out and voting again. And that's how we really changed this thing, because we're not going to change our outcomes with the same voters that have been determining all of our other outcomes.
Absolutely.
And we know that, and for a lot of people, especially coming from the Bronx, I understand the cynicism of not voting 10,000%. Because how many politicians have come through and promised things and then just ended up being major disappointments? And that erodes people's faith. But ultimately, if we're not at least suspending our disbelief for 1 day or 2 days on election day, we can go back to the cynicism. We're just asking for 2 days out of the year to just cast a vote, because the system that we have now is with the electorate that we have now. And when we expand that electorate, really unpredictable, positive things can happen.
Now, what's your relationship with Bernie Sanders?
Well, I organized for Bernie in 2016, but I didn't know him personally back then. I was just in the South Bronx where we set up an organizing hub out of like an old nail salon on 138th.
So you never met him at that time. You just
Never met him. I met him after I won my primary election. But now, now we speak a lot more often, and he is something of a mentor as well, in terms of how you navigate a system that is so hostile to working people.
Well, can you dispel what are some of the misconceptions of democratic socialism?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions. One is that there's a huge generational divide. Older people tend to think of democratic socialism through the lens of the Cold War, right? Like they think of communism and they think of all of these things. Younger people, I think, our views on democratic socialism have been really shaped in our political upbringing. And I think this is something that I try to communicate to people. The first time I ever voted in an election, when I turned 18, was for Barack Obama. And now the people who voted for Barack Obama at the youngest possible age that they could vote for him, now we're in our 30s. And so the last 10 years, our entire adult political lives have been shaped by the discourse. And so since the time I was 18 years old, Republicans and people at large have called healthcare socialist, public education socialist. They've called systems that the rest of the modern developed world has, like universal healthcare, paid family leave, tuition-free public colleges and universities. All of those things are called socialist or democratic socialism. But for me, while some people say, oh, this comes from like Karl Marx and all of these things, my political ideology has really come from people in the American tradition like Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King. Even Albert Einstein was a democratic socialist. Ella Baker, James Baldwin. All of these folks come from a tradition of critique of this obsession with money and profit and capital at all human and environmental costs. And when you actually examine our history, and when you actually look at the present day, some of the most popular policies and things that we have are not capitalist. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, libraries, public schools, firefighters, infrastructure, none of these things were built because they come at a profit. We've decided that some things are sacred, that we don't make money off of the backs of babies trying to educate them to read.
It's just being a human being.
There are some things, exactly. There are some things that should be economic or social rights, and we've established that as such.
It's like, to me, when I hear democratic socialism, I hear compassionate capitalism. Why not tweak the message just a little bit?
I think there's a lot of people will, I think they'll internalize it or they'll have a concept that's best for them. And so if that's how you see it, then I think that's how you see it. I do think that there are important differences because, Social Security, the idea that our elders should age with dignity, it's just not capitalism. It's compassionate capitalism to me is like raising the minimum wage a little bit. And to me, democratic socialism is unionizing your workplace or having a worker cooperative. It's a different structure. And it's like having a little bit more of a compassionate version of the system that's already stripping people of so much right now. I think we need more than that. I think we need changes in workplaces, whether it's worker cooperatives, profit sharing, things like that, where people who actually work in workplaces are rewarded, as opposed to just people at the very top, is really important. And so, if it makes some people more comfortable to say compassionate capitalism, that's one thing. But I think ultimately we need to be clear about the policies that we're fighting for.
Let me tell you something, Elsie. I like the fact that you shake shit up.
Thank you.
Okay, and you've really challenged the senior leadership in the Democratic Party. How's your relationship with them now?
I think I think the one thing that I'm thankful for is that I do think that people now know that now that I'm a year in, that I'm not doing this to play games. This is not like an ego thing. This is not for my health. I think there is a certain degree of respect that they know that when I'm being a pain in the butt, it's over an issue. It's over families. It's like, it's always for a reason. It's always to make sure that we're pushing as hard as possible. And it may be inconvenient. You know, for example, there were 2 bills pushing through right now in Congress on marijuana deregulation and legalization, or cannabis deregulation and legalization. So one is a justice bill, and it's making sure that we are taking care of and expunging people's records, and that we are making right in the criminal justice side. And the other side is the banking side, which is to allow banks to actually deal with incoming money from what we now deem as federally illegal in purchases of cannabis. And so, you know, one of the confrontations that I had this year was, we should not pass the banking bill first. We should pass the justice bill first.
And that seems like a given that has
to
pass.
us.
Yeah.
To us, it's a given. But of course, the easier thing to pass is the banking bill, right? Because these banks do not care about whether cannabis is legal or not. If anything, they want it legal so that they can have that in their banks, but they are not as invested in the expungement of people's records.
Yeah, the people that are locked up doing 20,
Exactly.
30 years for weed. Yeah.
Exactly.
The black and brown people.
Yeah, and here's the actual problem is that the people who made money and profited off of private prisons now get to turn around and take that capital and be the first people to invest in you know, the market for marijuana and cannabis.
Yep.
And so then the same people who profit off of private prisons can now profit off the legalization of marijuana. Meanwhile, it's our communities that are still dealing with the scourge, even if you're out, still having that on your record, keeping you from employment, from housing, from having a good job or getting back into school. And so right now, you know, it's one of those things where it's like seen as annoying, or it's a fight because I'm saying we should do things differently, because when you pass the justice piece first and the banks understand that the justice piece needs to go first before the banking piece, all of a sudden you'll get that banking support on the justice piece. So, you know, but I think ultimately the relationship is okay. You know, I'm not trying to like curry favor or be liked, but ultimately I think that's also why there's some kind of respect there too, because people know that it's about issues.
It's definitely not easy to be in the position that you're in, right? You get a lot of criticism. I saw the New York Post did like 20 stories on you in one day.
They're obsessed.
You hot out here. You hot out here.
And they're like the craziest stories. But another thing I was going to say is that you are trying to work really hard to make sure, like you said, you don't want to be lonely anymore, and bring more women and bring younger people into office and help them and encourage them to run for office and support them financially, because it is people have the perception that if I want to run for office, I have to have millions of dollars even to be able to have this campaign and to have people go out and vote for me. So let's talk about some of the people who you are actually supporting, because you've started your own political action committee to help support those people.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about this because also all of it is people funded. So often, here's the rub too, is that so often if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're queer or trans or have any sort of, you know, if you're working class or poor, it is really hard to break into that system. And so often the easiest way is to do it the same way that everyone else has done it, which is to curry favor with special interest groups or lobbyists or corporations. And especially because it's kind of like hot right now to support women, it's also hot right now for, you know, Wall Street to maybe support a woman candidate. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're fielding diverse candidates that also continue to have the integrity of fighting for progressive causes. So it's not just what you look like or who you are, it's also matching that with your experience and making sure that we can support you in a way where you can stay real and stay who you are. And so that's the important piece that I think we're trying to bring in. And so we've endorsed a couple of candidates in the Bronx, in the South Bronx. We've endorsed Samelis Lopez, who's a longtime community organizer. That's, you know, she's formerly homeless, and she has these experiences in the shelter system. And I believe, you know, there's a lot of people out there in Washington or in Albany, and they think they're experts because they read all the white papers and because they, you know, talk to policy experts, but there is no replacement for the lived experience. No one knows the shelter system better than someone who's lived in a shelter. Right. Mm-hmm. No one understands, healthcare the way that someone who's had to navigate this system was, and a lot of what I know and what I bring to policy too is my experience as a waitress. I waitressed when I was running for office, and well before then, not for like a summer, but for years. And so I know what it's like to try to buy healthcare off the Obamacare exchange, and it's like $200 a month.
Do they tip well in the Bronx?
Well, I worked down in Union Square, so
they still got your picture there, on the site. They still use your picture shaking the thing too, by the way.
But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, and so we have to support those folks. There's in Texas, we have a Senate race coming up. We're supporting Cristina Ramirez, Georgette Gomez out in California. There's a lot of different candidates that were coming out to support.
Now, break this down a little bit more for me, though, because the organization is going against the DCC, the primary candidates. What exactly does that mean?
Well, I actually wouldn't say that it's going up against the DCCC, but basically Democrats have, like the Democratic Party has a campaign arm. It's called the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And they're the ones that kind of they pick candidates ahead of time. They help people fundraise. Like a lot of most members of Congress, they fundraise through call time. So they take 2 to 4 hours a day and just call people for donations and for money so that they can run for re-election. And we operate on a fundamentally different model. We do all small dollar grassroots donations, because even if you're not taking money from a corporate lobbyist, if you're still only talking to and calling people who can afford to just give you $3,000 in a day, you're talking to people who are not like most working families. Right. And and it's not just that you're asking them for a check. They're giving you their opinion, and they're telling you what they think you should do. And the kind of subtext of it is, you should kind of do what I'm telling you to do, or else I may stop giving. And so there's like departures every now and then, but ultimately you're listening to rich people all day telling you what they think you should be doing in politics and what they think is a winning strategy. But ultimately that's very, very different than A, what actually is a winning strategy, and B, what maximizes well-being for working people.
Now, being from New York, what do you think about former Mayor Bloomberg running for president? What are your thoughts?
I think it's not a good idea. I think our experiences have seen this, from stop and frisk to the surge in housing costs in New York City to even his own history on redlining, to how he talks about transgender people. I don't think it's the smart thing to do. I think people think that his money makes it a safer bet against Trump, and I actually don't think that that's the case at all.
How do you explain so many black people falling in line for Bloomberg?
Well, I think a lot of people don't know Bloomberg. Like, we're here in New York City. We lived under his tenure as mayor. We know exactly what he did, and this is part of what he's doing. Like, when he comes in, swoops in super late in the game with billions of dollars at his disposal and is able to kind of shower the airwaves with his cash, but also he funds a lot of nonprofits and a lot of charities with, his Bloomberg philanthropies. And so I think
and mayoral campaigns.
Yeah, and mayoral campaigns and all sorts of stuff. And he also gave a lot to a lot of different campaigns. So I think people see what he's done with his money. They haven't, and I think a lot of people may have endorsed him without seeing what he did when he actually had a position of power.
I think they feel like he could beat Trump, and that's the main thing. That's what I think people look at.
That's not enough for me, just somebody that can beat Trump.
I agree. I agree. We have to beat Trump, but if we beat Trump and go back to the same policies that we had before, a worse Trump is going to come. A Trump that's more sophisticated, whose fascism is less obvious, is going to come, and things could get even worse.
Would you ever take money from Bloomberg?
No. No.
Now, you
I would
talked about-
never
I'm
take
sorry.
money from Bloomberg.
You talked about redlining and, talking about the Bronx. They're saying the Bronx is the next area. It's supposed to be growing. It was what Queens was years ago. It's what Brooklyn was years ago. How do you stop them from pushing people out of the Bronx like they did in Queens, and like they did in Brooklyn, like they did in Jersey City and Hoboken and all those areas?
Well, you stop giving tax breaks to corrupt developers. You actually invest in the families there. It's like this idea that cleaning up a community, when people talk about cleaning up communities, they use it as a code word for displacing communities. And what they mean is like cleaning the people out of some of these communities. And I think there are some ways that we stop that. One is that, there's an insane amount of tax incentives to displacing communities, to building. We need to build housing. We absolutely need to build housing, but we need to build housing that people can actually afford to live in. And the idea that we gave tax cuts to developers and deem affordable housing, like in Spanish Harlem, to be $2,000 a month for a studio apartment it's completely insane. And some of my families in my community, like, been living in our parts of the Bronx for 20, 30 years. And there's some people, 90-year-old women, that are now being forced to move out of their homes because they can't afford their rent anymore. How is a 95-year-old person or a 90-year-old person who's been living in the same neighborhood for 40 years supposed to move somewhere else?
That's right.
Like, it's criminal.
The biggest thing we see is people can't get loans. They can't get the loans to buy a house. So they have to rent an apartment, and they're staying in these apartments for 20, 30 years, and they don't own anything.
And the reason also that people can't get a loan, though, is that it's directly tied to housing prices. Because you can get a loan if an apartment is $45,000, $100,000, but you can't get a loan if the apartment. I was just walking through my neighborhood. There was a posting sign in the Bronx, in Parkchester, not even the South Bronx, which is like the part that they're trying to gentrify the most. In Parkchester, which is like almost the end of the 6 train, we're talking about $500,000, $300,000 to have a home or an apartment. I mean, like, how are you supposed to ask a normal person to qualify for a loan like that? And a lot of it has to do with interest rates, with how we're working with banks, and a lot of it has to do with tax cuts, the kind of tax cuts that we give to developers that we don't give to families.
Question: Why wouldn't you take money from Bloomberg? Only reason I ask is because I know he gave Stacey Abrams $5 million for Fair Fight 2020, and he said that he would give $1 billion to whoever the Democratic nominee is. Why can't we take his money?
I think. First of all, I think with Fair Fight, like, that is a nonprofit. It's an organization, and that's like, if you want to give your money to charity, that's completely different than kind of flooding our democracy. For me, one thing is that I don't need it. I've worked really, really hard to be financially independent of wealthy people in our in how I run for office. And so it's not money that I would take because I don't need it, and B, I don't think that it's worth
the optics of he donated all this money so he has some influence.
Well, more the optics, but the power. Like, it's not just, people say all the time, oh, I can take this check, it doesn't influence me. It does.
Right.
It does. Subconsciously or consciously. It absolutely does.
Even if he's just giving you the money because he wants to beat Trump. Like, he's saying, I'm giving this money just because I want somebody to beat Trump for a good cause.
I think there's a lot of ways he can do that to beat Trump that I don't necessarily need to accept.
Gotcha.
So he can fund lots of other candidates. He can fund organizations like Fair Fight, which is fighting voter suppression throughout the country, not just in Georgia, but the models that they're building can be used everywhere else. So he can fund. I don't think a dollar from Michael Bloomberg's wallet is like a morally wrong thing. But for me, I rely on small dollar donations, and I think that the independence for me is important. It's more important than the cash.
So the year is 2025. AOC is 35 years old. Eligible to run for president. And Bloomberg's like, here's $1 billion, AOC, rock out.
No.
Wow.
No.
Now, we talk a lot about these Democratic nominees and the past things that they've done that have affected us negatively. But what if some of these candidates come forward now and have some plans for the future? Do we say, okay, this was in the past, they've learned from that, and now they have these great plans that they're implementing that can really help our communities and speak to the issues that I care about? Do we come to accept that? Because we don't know. Obviously, right now, Bernie Sanders looks like he's doing a great job and he's leading everybody in the polls. But whoever it is, do we rally behind that person if it's a Joe Biden or a Bloomberg, even though their past we don't agree with?
Bernie too, though. Bernie voted for the crime bill.
I think so. First and foremost, I think that redemption in politics is an acceptable thing, but you have to earn it. And it doesn't just happen from like running now and you have a plan and you endorse certain positions now. It needs to be proven through years of work and evolution for the right thing. And so if you were on the wrong side of issues and then all of a sudden, you know, and this is what happened with Bloomberg.
Right. All of a sudden now.
He was down with stop and frisk. He fought for it in the courts. The courts overturned it as unconstitutional. He still fought it, defended it after him being mayor. And then
This is the first time we've heard him say it was wrong.
5 minutes before he runs for president, he says, okay, maybe this wasn't the right
Pops
thing.
up at a black church.
So, yeah, exactly. And you can't pop up at a church 5 minutes before you're running for office and saying it's all good now. It's not like that. And it's not to say, you know, there is room for redemption, but it needs to be done through your actions, not just whenever you want something and not just whenever you are looking for a vote. And at least for me in my first year in office, these fights are hard. They are politically inconvenient. You talk about bail reform right now in New York City, and you have people that are standing up trying to defend some of the gains that were made. This is not an easy fight. You have the Post going after you every single day for fighting for criminal justice reform. You have every single newspaper that's owned by a billionaire. You have every single, you know, TV pundit who has millions of dollars or who are lobbyists for, you know, Uber or whomever coming after you. What are people doing in that moment? You know, what are they giving before they ask for what they want to take? And so I think that you know, people need to prove through their actions and through what they're willing to withstand, how down they're going to be with our communities. But I also think that this year is just tremendously dangerous. Like if we elect Trump again, I don't even know what is going to be left after 4 years of that. But that's why I think we have to nominate someone who can do both.
Who is that person, though? Because, I mean, listen, everything you're saying is true, but none of these people have proven themselves when it comes to black and brown communities. Not to me. When it comes to legislation, policies, like who?
I think, so I think, first of all, electoral politics is always going to be disappointed to a certain extent. And I think that there is a problem where we lean on saviorism a lot.
Yes.
And like no elected official is going to save anybody. And I'm saying that as an elected official because, first of all, it's all part of a larger system. So you can have one great, amazing, incredible elected official. They're still in a system that's completely bogged down in the legacies of racism, basically American apartheid with Jim Crow, with the genocide of Native people, with you know, the fact that we marginalize the people who have always lived on this land, which are Latinos and descendants of Latinos who are Native American, who are descendants of Native Americans. So I think that there's knowing that. I think what's really important and what's special right now about this moment is that we are starting to get politicians that are accountable to mass movements. And I think Bernie Sanders has that accountability to mass movements. I think you have some folks you had some great candidates in this. Julian Castro, I think Elizabeth Warren has some of that accountability as well. And we're just starting to get that. So I understand why people look at this whole field and don't feel particularly inspired. But I think if we continue to support those candidates that are accountable to mass movements, and I think that Bernie is the most accountable to mass movements.
Who would you like to see as his vice president?
Got to be a black woman.
I mean, of course, we'd like to see diversity on that slate. There's a lot of great candidates out there. I don't know.
Are there people you like in particular? Have you been thinking about it? Like,
I
and then
haven't.
Vice President.
I haven't thought about it a lot, but I know. I mean, I have no idea. I'm gonna get in trouble.
I'd love to see Nina Turner with Bernie.
Nina Turner's incredible.
I think that Bloomberg is going to announce Stacey Abrams, and I think Biden and Senator Harris would be formidable. I just think you have to have a woman of color with you as your VP.
I think it's important to have that diversity at the top of the ticket, and it's not just. But I think it's really important that we don't just start engaging in tokenism. Like, it's not just about putting a woman of color or a black woman just because they're a woman of color or a black woman. It's like,
oh no, those three are more than qualified.
Of course. And so following through on those commitments to our community as well, and talking about these issues intersectionally, because, minimum wage is a racialized policy, and housing is racialized policy, and healthcare is racialized policy, and there are a lot of people out here that think this is like class versus race, and I think it's the most mistaken assessment and analysis there is, because people a lot of times they think first of all in America, race and class are not separable. Like they cannot be separated. There's this amazing article that was done by Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 Project, and she talked about how American capitalism started on the plantation, which is true, because you took this huge labor source and you stole it, and you turned America into a superpower off of it, off of free labor and the owning of human beings. And that is not something that just happened a long time ago. That wealth then was passed down to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And then it was protected with policies like Jim Crow, like redlining, like mass incarceration, that protected that racialized concentration of wealth in the United States of America. And so when people say it's class, not race, there is no such thing. And it's like, it's like asking, it's like when you're eating something and it's like, take the eggs out of it after it's already been cooked. It's like, that's how people try to talk about this issue, as though black women aren't some of the largest proportion of people who are earning $15 an hour or less than $15 an hour, who should be earning $15 an hour, as though healthcare issues aren't impacting our communities in disproportionate ways, like childhood asthma is the highest where? In the South Bronx. And so I think it's really important that we take an intersectional approach to things. But that's not to say that, like, there's a lot of people who will come back and they're like, okay, well, I'm white, I grew up poor. Talk to me about my privilege. Like, I didn't grow up privileged. And so there's a certain extent where there is a common class experience, but a white person who's poor will not deal with the same racism as a black person who is just as poor.
A rich black person can go through a poor white neighborhood. I'm from the South, I'm from South Carolina. A rich black person can go through that poor white neighborhood, and the poor white person will still look down on that rich black person. In a heartbeat. Or
people say, oh, all you need is education. Black people with higher levels of education, oftentimes, they like the education is not like a racial equalizer for a white person with, say, I was born to a higher income bracket with less education. Like, these are things that are inherited, and inherited wealth is a major dynamic in the like 60% of wealth in the world is inherited.
And I have a problem with that. People love you because you fight for the regular person. But, when you look at what's going on in the Bronx, right? You look at, bodegas closing because people can't afford the rent. You look at a lot of, especially people in the Bronx, it seems like they own those medallions. And those medallions, tax medallions, have been handed down for years and years and years. And now those medallions mean nothing. Because they're Uber, so how do you fight for those people?
This is actually an issue that I specifically have taken on this year. We went on to the Financial Services Committee. I serve under Chairwoman Maxine Waters, and we did a hearing on this, and we actually brought in taxi cab drivers from my district to testify about this, because I think that they need a bailout.
Because they're committing suicide.
They absolutely are. They're going down to City Hall, and because they see no financial path forward for them. And by the way, they were set up. Like, this wasn't just, I mean, Uber was a huge contributing portion to it, but also the city pumped up the prices of medallions after 9/11.
For people that don't know, that don't live in New York City, to drive a yellow taxi cab driver, you had to own a medallion. Medallions were like $250,000, $300,000 to purchase.
Up to $1 million.
Up to $1 million. So people, immigrants, a lot of them would save their life savings and then pass it down to their kids. And now you don't need a medallion because Uber can you come in and just take it. So that medallion that you paid $1 million is worth nothing.
And there's all these extra prices too. Like, you know, after a certain amount of time, there's a surcharge for that. Then there's a surcharge to go to certain parts of the city. So it does make it a lot more expensive too, just for a ride.
It does. And the thing is too, is that there's multiple components. One is that you have the Uber thing that crashed the market, you know, really brought things down. But also you had predatory lending. So it was a perfect storm because the city pumped up the prices of medallions. And then you had these banks and different, I mean, Michael Cohen, he, like, you know, Trump's guy, he was part of a taxi medallion scheme. And what he did was, and what he did and what a lot of these folks do is that they give predatory loans. You have someone who just came to this country, father, 4 kids, and I've seen their invoices and I've seen their tax returns myself. They're making $20,000, $30,000 a year, and a bank approved them, or a lender approved them for $1 million loan to buy a taxi medallion. That's predatory lending. That's absolutely predatory lending. And it's a combination of the price that the city set, the complete lack, like Wild West style, you know, actions of banks targeting the people who are most vulnerable. And then you have the market influence of Uber coming in, just like wiping everything out. And so I believe, and what we've been fighting for, is a bailout for taxi drivers who got caught up in this mess because they were targeted and they were victimized by banks. There's like, you look at any lending sheet, you were just talking about how people can't get a loan to purchase a home here in New York City. Then like, on what business does a bank or a lender have giving someone making $20K, $1 million, saddling them with $1 million worth of debt? It is wrong. So here's the ultimate crux when it comes to our politics. When it comes to bailing out a bank, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. When it comes to bailing out these taxi cab medallions, all we're hearing right now is excuses. And so I do think we are making progress on this issue. We did a congressional hearing, and they're now starting to explore a solution here. But again, it was because of movement spaces. This didn't happen because I woke up one day and say, okay, what do I want to do for people? It was because we're working in conjunction with people, because drivers started to organize and they came to my office. And like, when we talk about the importance of elections, the thing that's important to me is what's important is electing people who are accountable to movements, who will be responsive to that. But again, elected officials aren't here to save anybody. They need to be responsive, and they are not right now.
Now, you mentioned generational wealth too, and you know, in our communities, a lot of kids now are starting to make money. But you know, we can't pass that money down to our kids because we're being taxed so high when we die, but yet you have other people that's been doing it for so long, and they can create generational wealth. You have white people that pass money down, but we can never create generational wealth because we're always taxed. How do we stop that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's less tax and it's more the structures. Well, maybe it is tax in a way in that, like, a lot of very wealthy people, they know how to hide their wealth.
Right.
Yep.
And
They dodge
so,
those taxes.
but even when you look at things like an estate taxes don't kick in until you're at like millions of dollars. So until you're at the point where someone in your family is passing away and they are not like 1 million or 2 million, but millions and millions of dollars, that's when something like an estate tax kicks in. But I do think that people need to be paying their fair share because a lot of people are parking their money in the Cayman Islands. There was, there was a whole slew of documents that came out years ago, Panama Papers, that talked about how much of global wealth is being hidden and skirted away. And that's money. It's so criminal because what you're asking is for everyday people to actually pay for the systems that we use in our country, whereas the wealthiest people benefit from those systems.
Right.
They benefit from our patent system. There's a reason America has so much innovation is because we have very strong patent protection laws, that if you develop a technology, your intellectual property can be deemed as yours. And so we benefit from all of these different kinds of systems, but the people who benefit from it don't pay back into it. And that's why, I think that's why Bernie Sanders scares a lot of these folks, because they're participating in a lot of this stuff. He scares people who are hiding their wealth. He scares people who make billions of dollars off of paying people modern day, less than subsistence wages.
How do you feel about Bernie bros and gals who attack people who speak out against Bernie on social media?
Well, when I see some of this behavior, it's unacceptable, right? So like if you're out here attacking a person personally, it's one thing to be tough in a debate and to point out hypocrisy and to say, this doesn't make any sense, or this position hurts working people. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to just be dehumanizing. And the thing about the internet is that it is just like, it puts dehumanization on hyperspeed. And we see that everywhere from our schools all the way up to, adults. Like, it's just so easy now for a kid to drop a comment, or for a person to drop a comment that they would never say in real life.
Absolutely
you
not.
experienced that a lot.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
even with the president, the president threw some shots with you. I think he would never say to you.
no, he would
called you a
not.
whack job.
A whack job.
Yeah,
A
he
whack
never
job.
would. He keep that same energy.
I always
when
think it's
he
a
needs to.
compliment when Donald Trump.
Keep that same energy when you see me, Donald.
I always think
Exactly.
it's a compliment when Donald Trump doesn't like you. It's like, I'm doing something right. That means-
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he's scared. I think he's scared.
But let me
you
ask you
surprised?
this: how much do you experience sexism in your position? Because I was looking the other day, and I think like if it was a man in your position,
Yeah.
you wouldn't get as much criticism as you do. But I was seeing how they were criticizing like you for wearing a dress that costs $200-something.
Yeah.
But men wear suits, or they don't ever ask, okay, how much was his suit? How much was his tie? How much were his cufflinks? How much did he spend on that?
Yeah.
But I saw them really coming hard at you just over a dress
Yeah,
that
I
you wore.
mean, it's like asking how you navigate like race in the world. I mean, it's literally who you are. Everything that virtually every reaction to you is racialized or sexualized in some way. It's not like I run through the world and there's like no photos, and that it's just like candidate A says this and you vote based on that. We all have subconscious biases, and especially if you're a woman of color on the internet, it's like open season. But it can also be your superpower,
Right.
too. And I think a lot of times people want us to shy away from being feminine, from being black, from being brown, to temper ourselves, to be less than, to change how we talk, to change how we dress, because there is profound cultural power that helps us communicate important political concepts and economic concepts.
Were you surprised when Donald Trump, we'll go back to that, were you surprised when he sent out that tweet?
No.
You weren't surprised. You knew it was coming.
I felt it coming because he's obsessed with television, and so he responds to things that he sees on television, and because I'm on Fox News like all the time, it felt like it was kind of a matter of time. But also, he doesn't like attention not being on him. So if attention's on anyone else, if it's on Adam Schiff, it's on Nancy Pelosi, if it's on Colin Kaepernick, he's gonna try to find a way to reel that back in
He's
to
really good at
himself.
it.
And he is,
Narcissism.
because he's a narcissist, but he is good at it.
I don't know if I blame the media for that or him, because it's like
It's both.
Yeah.
It's like an addictive, unhealthy relationship that they have. They can't stop covering him, and he can't stop consuming it.
Isn't that dangerous for you though? Like being AOC, when you have the president calling you a whack job, people coming at you. Isn't that dangerous?
It's very dangerous.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous. Yeah. I mean, I had a point last year where I would wake up in the morning and I'd look at pictures of people who were trying to harm me that day.
Wow.
Like over my breakfast. you know, and a lot of times it was white supremacists, and it's very real. Like, it's very, very real, and it's very scary. And that's why I think when people, like, especially on the far right, they're like, oh, this is an attention thing. It's like, I am not doing this for my health.
It's actually bad for your health.
Yeah, it is.
Dangerous.
It is. But I think that ultimately, like, whether it's in a high profile way, but there are tons of ways in which people stand up in low profile ways. When you're at your job and you're in a room and everyone is saying something wrong, it's really scary to stand up to your boss. Or it's like really scary to be, you know, or if you're hanging out with your friends and let's say you're hanging out with a bunch of guy friends and they're all like kind of talking about someone in a really dehumanizing way, it's really hard to stand up and to say those things because you can get, there's social consequences. Mm-hmm. You could feel like you're being ostracized or you lose your job. But now is the moment for that. Like right now is the moment for that.
So do you pull up to the Bronx and hire some goons? What do you do?
I actually feel safest in the Bronx.
I figured that. Yeah. The Bronx ain't gonna let that happen.
I feel safest in the Bronx. It's when I'm in D.C. that I feel way less safe, actually.
Bring some of them brothers and Tims to D.C.
Yeah.
What's up?
And it's funny. I go home and like, you know, I live in the same neighborhood that I've always lived in, and so like if any of my neighbors or anyone in the building sees anything off, I mean, you know how it is. It's like a new car or anything like that. People are like, "Hey, have you seen that? Like, go to the store, stay in there."
Right, and be like, "Be careful, there's someone outside. It doesn't look right."
But like nothing ever weird has happened. But the funniest thing was one time. New York One, like the news truck came and we were doing an interview and all my neighbors were like, New York One's out here. Like, like go to the store, hide in there. I was like, no, it's fine.
I want to ask you a few more questions. You challenged Nancy Pelosi once, but on The View you called her Mama Bear and you said, tell people don't mess with Mama Bear.
Yeah.
So when you see somebody like Susan Sarandon, you know, promoting to primary Nancy Pelosi, how did that make you feel?
Well, I think it like you can hold two things at the same time. You know, it's kind of like when you have family and you argue with people in your family, but you're still at the end of the day a family. I think it's kind of like that within a party, is that ultimately, you know, we're going to disagree with each other, and sometimes those disagreements are going to be big disagreements. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we defeat Trump, and like a Democratic majority at the end of the day, as problematic as it can seem sometimes, is better than a Republican majority. But you know, and you know, Nancy Pelosi is just insanely skilled. Like whether you agree with her or disagree with her, no one can say she doesn't know what she's doing. And
so that tweet from Susan Sarandon fair?
Well, you know, first of all, you will never hear me speak out against a primary election because I won in a primary election. And so, like, I think it's wrong for me to close the door behind me to say, oh, I can get here this way, but no one else should. So just out of principle, you're not going to see me, like, speak out against primary elections because because it would be hypocritical. So it doesn't bother me. I think everyone has the right to run for office if that's what they want to do.
So you support incumbent candidates? Or?
I support incumbent candidates and I support primary challengers.
Gotcha.
It's all about the work that you're putting up.
Got you. And I saw people calling you a hypocrite because you got your goddaughter into a charter school a few years ago, and they say that's a no-no for the Democratic Socialist base. How do you respond to that?
Well, you know, so like it's true. One thing is that we do need to address situations with charter schools, I think. It doesn't mean that they're all bad. It doesn't mean that they all should 100% go away. But, and we saw this under Bloomberg's presidency, is that, you know, the charter school movement, especially in New York City, started in about the 1970s. They were community charters. So it was pastors, community organizers, starting community-based schools. So the school came from the community, was for the community. And then there are other models that are almost like corporate school type of models that exploded, that hand a ton of money to like these contractors, and it can, in some ways, it can be a drain sometimes on traditional public school systems. But that being said, you know, my family's in the South Bronx. My cousin he, and my goddaughter, he made a choice given what that was in the South Bronx. And he asked me to help him. Would I help him fill out the form so that he could pursue this choice that he made for his daughter? And how are you going to tell someone no? You know?
Right.
How are you supposed to tell somebody no in that situation? Because ultimately, the present situation is that, and the situation that he was in was that we grew up and he was raised in the Bronx when dropout rates were 40, 50, 60%. And his school was completely, totally inadequate. And he was faced with the choice a generation later to send his daughter to that same school without enough improvements.
No,
and
I get
so,
it.
so
you
the
want
deal
best
is,
education possible.
so what we fight for is policy where he never has to make that choice again.
Yeah, no, I
Isn't that
get
the
it.
problem when you're labeled something, right? You call you a democratic socialist, so they can't see the nuance. You have to be one way and one way only, right? They can't see the nuance in anything. Isn't that part of the problem?
Well, to me, I'd rather have that problem. It's like politics is about like picking your problems, and and I'd rather have the problem of people saying, "Okay, this is what we expect her to stand up for," than someone saying, "What does the Democratic Party stand for?" I don't know what being a Democrat means.
And I get it because, growing up in New York, a lot of times the schools, the quote unquote zone school that you have to go to is one of the worst schools. I remember growing up as a kid, Andrew Jackson was my zone school, the first first school in the country to get metal detectors. My parents were like, "You're not going there. If I have to work extra, do overtime, I'm going to put you somewhere else." But they didn't have that option because we still paid taxes, but they had to pay for a Catholic school because I couldn't go to that school. They were like, "There's no way in hell I'm gonna let you go to that school."
Yeah.
So I get it 150%.
Yeah, and so the space where people will say, "Oh, this is hypocritical," etc. It would be hypocritical if we weren't proposing policies where
you don't have to make choices.
you
like
don't
that.
have to make choices like that. I understand in the short term, okay, I need to send my kid to a school today. Like, what do I do? And people struggling with that choice and people trying to doing the best that they can given those conditions. But that's why we fight so that schools aren't under-resourced like that. And, we need to start having real conversations about why property taxes fund local schools. Because what it does is that it forces people to run away from each other. To say, I don't want to live next to anybody poor. I don't want to live next to... It forces people to want to live with only people who are richer than them.
As crazy as that sounds, it's the truth.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions. Bernie, his main push, one of his main pushes is Medicare for all. But you recently said we may need to be flexible on that to get things done.
Yeah.
What changed for you?
So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. So because when I was talking about this issue, I was talking about our compromises with the ACA when we were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act in the Obama administration. And we had the window to fight for a public option. And then, as we know, Joe Lieberman did his thing, and we didn't get it. And so for me, I think what's really important is that we fight for the full freight of Medicare for all. And so this is not about rolling back on it at all. In fact, if anything, we should talk about why a public option is not good. And the reason, or rather not as good for sure as Medicare for all. And the reason for that is because you set up a public option for insurance. When you let all the for-profit insurers continue to kind of reign in the way that they do, what they will do is that they will push off all the sickest people from their plans. So you get the Aetnas of the world, the Blue Cross Blue Shields, etc. The Emblem Healths and whatnot, they will start raising the bar so that the sicker you are, the less you can afford these plans, or they'll find other ways to kick you off. Then they kick off all the sick people onto the public option plan. And then all of a sudden, our public option seems crazy expensive because you have all sick people and no healthy people, which, as we know, does not work in insurance. So Medicare for all as a single payer system is the best way to do it, because if you do use a public option as a middle step, it actually, in my opinion, makes it politically less feasible to get Medicare for all, because what you're doing is that you're front loading all of the worst parts of the system, and then you're asking people to politically support expanding that into the good parts. And so people tried to kind of take it out and twist it, etc., as me saying that I believe a public option is an intermediary step. Do I think a public option, is like how that stacks up to our current system? Could there potentially be benefits? Maybe. But I think that if you really believe and if we really want to be on this fight for Medicare for all, we should fight for Medicare for all.
Okay.
She has to go.
Oh, man. What was the point of impeachment?
Well, I think the point of impeachment is rule of law. So the thing is if we let the president continue, if we allowed the president to continue doing everything that he did and the House didn't act, then it was going to be on us, right?
Because people were criticizing when there was no impeachment.
Then it's on us. It's Democrats who are choosing not to pursue the rule of law in the United States of America. Now that it's, moved to the Senate and the Senate acquits, this is on Mitch McConnell. This is on Marco Rubio. This is on Ted Cruz. This is on Susan Collins. This is on Lisa Murkowski. They are responsible for the degradation of the rule of law and our slow descent into fascism, frankly.
I don't think it's a slow descent.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, too. That's true.
I think
That's true. The elevator.
Yeah.
But I think it's a question of responsibility. And we needed, and we continue to need, to at least put up the fight to preserve our systems. And if Republicans are the ones that are willing to let that go because they are so adherent to Trump and because they bow at his feet and do whatever he tells them to do, and because they're scared of him and all of that stuff, that's on them. But we should not be scared of the president. If they want to be scared of the president, that's their business.
You think he loses in 2020? And the reason I say that is because I see Democrats cannibalizing each other so much. Like somebody like Joe Rogan comes out, endorses Bernie. People get mad and say, "Oh, don't accept that endorsement." Why not?
Yeah.
All hands on deck.
I think, first of all, I don't think November is a sure bet for anybody. I don't think it's a sure bet for anyone. And anyone that is telling you that any one candidate will for sure win or any other candidate will for sure lose is lying to you, because those are the same people that thought Hillary had it in the bag in 2016.
And that Obama would never win.
And that Obama would never win, and that someone like me could never be in politics.
And Trump couldn't be president.
And that Trump couldn't be president. And then after he won, there were still those same people saying he's not going to be that bad. Give him a chance. Right. So the people who are talking about who's going to win and who's going to lose this year, first of all, they are completely removed from the reality of American politics. Most of them have never knocked on a door in their life. And they do not know what it is to live in America today. So there's that. B, there is a very, it's just not certain. No matter who you nominate. You nominate the most conservative Democrat, it's a risk. You nominate the most liberal Democrat, it's a risk. You nominate the most moderate Democrat, it's a risk. And because we are in uncharted territory, which is why it's not any one person that's going to beat Donald Trump. We really need to come together in a huge mass movement, especially in electoral college states. This isn't about who gets the most votes. This is about who gets the most electoral college votes. So we need to be turning out, calling our friends and family in Philly, in these swing states, and whether it's, and I think focusing on cities in those swing states like Philly, like Detroit, Minneapolis, are going to be very critical in making sure that we protect our country.
So if Trump wins, do we move back to where we came from?
Oh, man. Well, some of us don't have the luxury.
Still in the United States.
We are here. But I think, it's dangerous now. It's dangerous now. And I think what we really need to do is inspire people who didn't turn out last time to turn out this time.
And Alexandria, as far as your career in politics, do you have some goals for yourself that you see outside of Congress in the near future?
No.
Stop it. It's clear you're setting up for a presidential run one day.
No.
Maybe mayor, maybe governor.
I don't think. I just I don't know. I'm an optimistic person, but I think that the things that we're fighting for right now, there are some people where you just need to put it on the line, knowing that it's going to limit your political prospects. And I'm comfortable with that. Like, I'm okay because I feel good about my first year because I called the detention camps at our border what they are.
Concentration camps.
Yes. And I feel good that I stood up in the way that I stood up. I feel good that I stood up for a 70% wealth tax on incomes above 10 million a year. I feel good about those things. But I also know that those severely, if I wanted something bigger, I would have been much more tepid. So,
but you're building a base, though. Like, you're not when you're eligible at 35 to run for president.
Yeah, but
so you're building a base now, like that diverse base you're talking about, that Obama coalition. You're kind of building that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's less about aspiring to a position as more about a mission. Like I 5 years ago, I didn't wake up and say, "Oh, I'm going to run for Congress." I wouldn't have been bartending in a restaurant if that was my long-term political plan. And so these last 2-3 years have been such an enormous whirlwind. And I happen to be a spiritual person. And so I wake up and just try to think of, given how things are right now, what are the best ways I can be a vessel for good? And maybe that means I continue my life in politics. Maybe it means I write books or become a professor, or I don't know, get a cabin somewhere. I have no idea. So I think for me, it's just a day-by-day thing. But I think that one of the biggest mistakes and one of the biggest reasons that our politics is so messed up is that everyone is always trying to run for president. And so it prevents them from taking courageous stances. Because even though they're in a position today to do something, they're like, oh, if I do this now, how will this impact me if I want to run for president someday? F that.
That's right.
Like, F that. And so,
She means fuck, by the way.
That was the
Sorry.
Bronx that came out. That was the BX that came out. F that.
And so I don't think that we should be making decisions based on a positional aspiration. I think we should be taking positions and doing work based on what we're trying to accomplish in this country.
How many times have you called President Donald Trump an F-boy when nobody's around? Because you let that F that fly.
I do have a potty mouth, not in public.
You're from the Bronx. You're from the Bronx. From the Bronx. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, you don't be a stranger.
No, of course.
All
Thank you.
right.
So thank you for having me.
It's AOC. It's the Breakfast Club. Good morning.